friends. I do believe we are live again. This is Rose Solari. I'm a poet, fiction writer, book reviewer, teacher, and co founder of Allen Squire Publishing, a small press with big ideas. And it's nice to see you here again on Wednesday at 4 p.m. EST for another session of Rose Reads. I started this series on the 1st of April, the first day of National Poetry Month, when we were looking at a calendar of literary events, readings, conferences, and panels by all of our writers at ASP and seeing them get canceled one after another. It was heartbreaking, and as you know, small presses everywhere are suffering. Well, presses everywhere are suffering, but particularly small ones. So we thought that in order to be able to stay in touch with our audience of friends, poetry lovers, readers, we would start these broadcasts. James J. Patterson, my partner at ASP, and my husband, is doing broadcasts every Monday at 4 p.m. EST from this same room from a different angle. We call this the reading room. And I'll be with you every Wednesday. Poet Reuben Jackson is doing audios, which are posted every Thursday. And remember that these shows are always archived not only on Facebook, but on YouTube, Allen Squire Publishing, and at allensquirepublishing.com. Before we get started on today's theme, which is going to be about retelling the tale, or contemporary poems that retell classical myths, fairy tales, biblical stories, I just wanted to say, if you're watching these and you like them, it would be terrific if you would like and share. Remember that in these trying times, Amazon can't deliver books, but we can. All our books are on sale for ridiculously low prices at our site. Our ebooks are all on sale across the board, and we're not the only ones doing this. I'd like to tip my hat right now to Santa Fe Writers Project, Barrel House, and Jellyfish Review. There are several good presses right now that are doing all kinds of reach out, and they're working hard, and it would be great if you check them out as well. I'm going to start today's program by reading a bit of Louise Gluck. What we're talking about today is retellings, poets who retell classical mythology. Now, there are many fiction writers who do this as well, and when Poetry Month is over, I'm going to expand my content to include fiction, drama, essays, music, many other art forms. But for now, we're sticking with poetry. One myth that has captured and recaptured the attention of contemporary writers is the story of Persephone's abduction into Hades. This is a story that can be very challenging for a woman to read, because the implication seems to be that Persephone's abduction and rape somehow turned into a useful or a good thing in the end. This is a story with many facets. To retell it briefly, Persephone and her mother, Demeter, have a very close relationship. It's a story very much about mother love. And when Hades one day sees Persephone frolicking in the fields, grabs her and drags her into the underworld, Demeter's grief is so great. She's the goddess of the harvest, the goddess of grain. Her grief is so great that it overwhelms nature. Nothing will grow while the goddess of nature is grieving. So eventually a deal is brokered. Zeus has to come into the picture, as Zeus often does, and a deal is brokered that Persephone will spend 6 months of the year on the earth and 6 months beneath. As I began to look at this myth more completely, one of the things that intrigued me is that not only is she kidnapped into Hades, but she becomes a queen there. She rules there. So she does things well, obviously, even in this tremendously challenging situation. That intrigued me. And of course, there's the whole weight of literary interpretation around this story. Rita Dove, the great Rita Dove, has written a wonderful book-length poem about it called Mother Love. Louise Gluck has written a book-length poem about it called Averno. And I'm going to read just a snippet of the Louise Gluck book, because I think it shows how, in a poem about this kind of subject matter, you can tackle a lot of other ideas. And this is called Persephone the Wanderer, and I'm just going to read the first few stanzas. In the first version, Persephone is taken from her mother, and the goddess of the earth punishes the earth. This is consistent with what we know of human behavior, that human beings take profound satisfaction in doing harm, particularly unconscious harm. We may call this negative creation. Persephone's initial sojourn in hell continues to be pawed over by scholars who dispute the sensations of the Virgin. Did she cooperate in her rape? Or was she drugged, violated against her will, as happens so often now with modern girls? As it is well known, the return of the beloved does not correct the loss of the beloved. She comes back, but she comes back different. As I began to investigate more and more of the reasons that contemporary writers retell this story, a few things came to mind. One, obviously, is to rebalance the tale, as Gluck is doing here, giving it a contemporary context, asking questions about it. Is it really what we've thought it is all along, or is there something else going on here? And I have a series of poems in my second book about Persephone. I'm going to share one of those with you in a little while. This is my second book. It's called Orpheus in the Park. I'm holding it up right now because I love the cover, for one thing, painting by a wonderful painter named Travis Hall that we found in New Mexico, but also because this book is really two sequences of poems intertwined. It is the poems about myth, retellings of classical myth, biblical myth. I've got an Adam and Eve poem in there. So that's one strand that runs through the entire book. But then another strand is a strand of elegies, which I wrote at the same time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm going to share one of my own Persephone poems right now. And this is called Persephone Triumphant. It's, again, this myth is about so much. And I particularly am always intrigued by the ways in which human beings manage to make something positive of their suffering. I think that one of the reasons I'm drawn to myth is because there are so many stories of perseverance and survival, and like everything from Odysseus, for example, and his 10 years at war and then his 10 years to get home, to this story that begins as a story about mother love and ends as a story about power, the Persephone story. So here is one of my Persephone poems. A dear departed friend of mine, Meinrad Craighead, a great painter. She lived by the Rio Grande in a house she built herself. Astonishing lady. I'll talk about her art more another time. She always used to get a huge belly laugh out of the first two lines of this poem. So I think it's a compliment. Meinrad, I still think of you all the time, my dear. Anyway, this is called Persephone Triumphant. 6 months up and 6 months down, and she is not afraid of anything anymore. Not afraid of him, of his hot skin, of how desire falls from his back as he lifts up off of her, satisfied and spent, for he always comes back. And not afraid of her mother, whose insistent grief had seemed at times a huge mouth ready to swallow her alive. She is alive and happy. She knows the underworld, and no one now can tell her stories, make her hide beneath her bed. As a child, she jumped at everything, prepared for invasions of every sort, her mother blind in the way that mothers have to be, it seems, to get by. Now that's all over. Now the ones who laughed at her innocence ask for instruction, count on her kindness. Everywhere she is needed, somehow she appears transcendent, light, buffed by her suffering until she gleams, taught by the darkness to be so bright. So that's one myth that many, many people have retold. I would love to know what some of your favorite retellings are. I'm getting better at reading the comments that you're posting every week. So if you'd like to, why don't you post me a comment about what retellings you've particularly liked recently? I know Madeline Miller's novel Circe is getting wonderful attention. I know that for many of us, Derek Walcott's retellings have been a source of particular insight and power. I'm fascinated by, in particular, the fact that the late poet Derek Walcott, Nobel Prize winner, astonishing poet, fell so in love, it seems, with the Iliad and the Odyssey that he retold those stories twice. Once in his dramatic version of the Odyssey, which is a play, and once in Omeros, a big, chunky book-length poem that focuses on the Iliad. So I'm intrigued by how much he got out of that, and in particular felt very fortunate to see a production of the Walcott play at Arena Stage some years back. One of the things that hit me most in the retelling in that particular version, because what changes is so important. What a contemporary writer decides to alter in the original text is, I think, even more important than what they decide to keep and explore as is. And there's a beautiful, touching moment in Walcott's dramatic version of the Odyssey. You may remember that it begins with Telemachus, Odysseus' son, who has not seen his father in 20 years. And this is something that when I taught the Odyssey, always had an immediate bolt of recognition for my undergraduate students, because so many of them had fathers who were away at wars, or mothers. And so that notion of the young son left with one parent who's grieving, trying to figure out his place in the world, I think really affects many people very deeply. It's easily relatable. In the Walcott play, the moment that made me cry the most, I have to say, was when Telemachus visits Helen and Menelaus. So he visits Helen of Troy, who's the reason for the whole war. She's the reason his father's been gone so long, essentially. And when he visits her and her husband and meets her, in Homer's Odyssey, Telemachus is stunned by Helen's beauty, and he gets it. He starts to see why this all had to happen. In Walcott's version, she's a harridan, and her beauty is gone, and she's a nag, and she's a bitch. And she and Menelaus are just hanging on because they've been the cause of it all. So they can't say, I don't know what I saw in her to begin with, right? And Telemachus is so wounded because this is what he's lost his father to, in essence, nothing. A fraud, a sham, something not worth it. It's a devastating moment, and I highly recommend that play. If you're just joining us, we're at about the 15-minute mark. I'm Rose Solari with Allen Squire Publishing. If you're liking these little videos, I hope you'll like them and share them. I'm always looking for suggestions. Now that I know I'm going to keep going after National Poetry Month is over, I know I'll be moving on to talking about prose as well. I'd love to hear suggestions from you, from things you'd like me to read, discuss, talk about, share. And right now, I'd really like to know, for those of you listening, what retellings are your favorites? Remember, you can cast a wide net. West Side Story retells Romeo and Juliet. The Dire Straits song Romeo and Juliet retells West Side Story and Shakespeare. So there's a lot you can do with what are your favorite retellings, and I hope you'll share some of them with me. Some years back, I was asked to devise a course for the University of Maryland's undergraduate honors program. It was run at the time by Sandy Mack, a great Shakespeare scholar and teacher, great educator, a real hero of teaching and mentoring, I think. And I got a call from him that just had me tap dancing. He asked me if I would design a course to teach in his program that would combine critical writing and creative writing. And other than that, I had free reign. So I devised a course called Retelling the Tale, in which my students, they were freshmen and sophomores. It was a 2-year program, the first 2 years in general honors. And throughout the course, we read original texts and then retellings. So we read the Cupid and Psyche story, and then we read C.S. Lewis's novel Till We Have Faces that retells it. We read sections of the Odyssey, and then we read Walcott's play, and we saw the Coen brothers movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The students, so it progressed that way. The students would write critical papers along the way, short critical papers on these retellings and their origins. But the final project was to tell a story of their own, to pick a form: poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, drama, and then retell the story, whatever story they picked from that point of view. We had some fabulous retellings in that class. I remember in particular a young man who retold the Little Red Riding Hood story as a story of her being stalked by her mailman. The wolf was the mailman. And it was a 3-dimensional project. Part of what he turned in was a box of belongings of the little girls that he had stolen. The wolf had stolen. And one of my favorite memories from that class is a wonderful young man named Jason. He got a D on his first paper. The story of Cupid and Psyche failed to interest him in any way. But he fell in love with the Odyssey. And when we watched the Coen brothers version, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, which is very funny and very loose, but I thought they might enjoy it, especially up against some of the weightier retellings that we were reading. He was furious. I was sitting near him during the screening because he had 2 other guy buddies and they tended to distract each other. So I used to sit near them, try to keep an eye on them. And he was muttering 10, 15 minutes into the movie. He was saying, I hate this movie. And I said, Jason, what is the matter? What is it? And he said, Odysseus wasn't like that. George Clooney's making Odysseus a fool. He was actually great, and he was brave, and I have to say, I loved it so much to see how the retelling made him reappreciate the original. It was a truly beautiful teaching moment, and I remember running to Sandy Mac's office after class ecstatic and said, can you believe this happened? Isn't this great? Jason wrote a beautiful final project on Hercules. Jason was a wrestler, and he wrote a beautiful final project retelling the Hercules story. And it was such a great story for him to pick. A story about being big and muscular and almost too strong, and finding a way to use that. Another book we used in that class was Anne Sexton's Transformations. I see that someone has mentioned it in the comments, and I'm so glad. I love Sexton's retellings of fairy tales, and that is what her book Transformations was. I'm going to give you a little snippet. Sexton gets wild with these poems. They're long, they're discursive, they ramble, they mix contemporary events with fairy tale events, and she gives a spin to the Rapunzel story that's really quite interesting. She decides that the old woman who locked up... I'm sorry, I just got distracted by a comment. Her take is that the old woman who locks up Rapunzel is actually in love with her, and that they're lovers. And this is just the opening of her poem, Rapunzel. A woman who loves a woman is forever young. The mentor and the student feed off each other. Many a girl had an old aunt who locked her in the study to keep the boys away. They would play rummy or lie on the couch and touch, old breast against young breast. Let your dress fall down your shoulder. Come touch a copy of you. So wonderful. So as we continue our exploration of these retellings, I thought I'd share a couple more of my own. One of the first ones I wrote was about Hephaestus and Hera. I was taken at the time by stories. There were some stories in the paper. It seems like there always are stories in the paper, which is terrible, about women who had killed their own children. And it made me think about the Hera and Hephaestus story. In some versions of this story, Hephaestus is the god of the forge. He made Odysseus's shield. He's an artist. Um, in some versions of the story, Hera had him to get revenge on Zeus for his philandering, and when that didn't work, she threw him off Olympus. In some versions, Zeus throws him off Olympus. As with all these old stories, they survive like bones, I think, like the bones of stories. And then in their ancient retellings and the more contemporary retellings, they keep changing. Like the flesh is different, they get fleshed out differently. But these are these interesting bones. And here, the bone to me that we were gnawing at was what happens to a parent who kills their child? Why? Why would they ever consider doing that? And so here's the poem I wrote about that. It also has to do, I think, with how we make art, what we do with our suffering, as far as how we turn it into something good. I just saw another friend mention Into the Woods, the Stephen Sondheim play that retells a bunch of fairy tales. It is a wonderful, wonderful play. Great call, Tim, and just vintage Sondheim. All right, this is called Hephaestus and Hera. How could she abandon the boy who only asked that she protect him from his father? How could the mother throw up her hands, cast out the child she'd made to help her in her loneliness? For already her husband wanders, ignores the plaintive tone of her voice, turns the sounds that not so long ago had won his heart against her as he heads for the door. She covers her swollen eyes in layers of makeup. And now she looks at the boy she might have loved and sees only herself, what she has become, pathetic, miserable, a devoted wife turned to tricks beneath any courtesan. For what is a child, after all, but a string that attaches mother to father? How could she believe she could make something perfect all of her own? In the dark, she leads him outside, walks holding his hand to the edge of the cliff, takes one step as if into the air, and then, when he follows, lets go of his hand. As she returns to her room, she covers her ears from his cries. And he uncoils his body from the crumple of his fall, touches his injured foot, and stares up at the place from which his mother's face still fades between the stars. There are losses we cannot allow ourselves to know. For now he begins to work a fallen branch into the shape of a splint for his foot. Then he changes his mind and begins to make something called art. There are, of course, so many wonderful myths about art, and one of my favorite stories has always been the Orpheus and Eurydice story, and this is one that is retold and retold. Gregory Orr has a beautiful book of poems that retell that entire myth, a book-length sequence of poems. Salman Rushdie has an astonishing novel called The Ground Beneath Her Feet that retells this story. In fact, I wanted to use an epigraph from the Rushdie book in front of Orpheus in the Park. And then I got a little nervous because this book's so good. I wasn't sure that I could stand the comparison, so I didn't. But I'm going to read you the title poem from Orpheus in the Park. And then I'm going to close with something funny, because I know last week with our tribute to Stanley Plumley, we shed a lot of tears together out here, folks. And I think we need to walk out of here with a smile on our faces today. When I was working on this book, I knew that there was a poem out there that would pull the strands together of the personal and individual and the mythic. I just didn't know what the poem was going to be yet. But I've always been, I love music. I love music almost as much as I love poetry, and I listen to it constantly, and I'm always on the hunt for new, interesting songwriters. I often have wondered when I'm walking down the street and I see somebody busking if maybe that young woman or young man could be the embodiment of Orpheus in the present day. Uh, Jimmy talked last week in his broadcast about the notion that Hermes, the god of communication, might suddenly appear to you and give you some information. I often wonder if Orpheus is out there singing for us. I often wonder about Eurydice and the notion that maybe she didn't want to be dragged out of the underworld too terribly much. Maybe Orpheus's idea wasn't such a good one. So I will read this poem to you called Orpheus in the Park, title poem of my second book. For all the time he can remember, it has been his. A voice that hits, secure, the center of each note. As in the often heard but no less worthy image, the arrow that carves in two the one before that split the one before that hit the target's flag red, heart red center. If you heard him as you walked maybe through a city park in spring, saw his feet beat out the time while he strummed and sang, turning the golden lyric into dark earth, then into gold again, you might have wept. It's only a story, your companion says, for comfort. It's the only story this boy will ever tell. The gods are jealous and know us to be weakest and most worth envy when in love. So when the girl, near but never to be a bride, walks in the grass, she does not see the glittering, ignorant thing that will make her tale worth singing. As fangs sink into skin, she begins to cry out, then thinks, how silly. I will die anyway. Her body falls. The soul penetrates the ground, mist after rain. Science says wherever we walk, we change the future. Myth says every step we take is a step into the past. What if her loveliness, that is, her human body, was like a dress, the thing she used to cover her real self, and being longed for only shrank her in her skin? They love me for my flesh, which is not me. So when the snake strikes, rising fast for the narrow ankle, it gives her the respite she may not have known she wanted. How quick the move that lifts us out of time and into the never again. There is love that rises, and there is love that falls. How could she know which kind this song would be about? No matter how the music hurts, it hurts less than life. As you sit weeping at some concert, perhaps, your lover at your side, you feel the luxury of created hurt, a worked echo of the spinning blades slung by your own desires. Later, safe in your bed, you think, I was not myself. I was not in my right mind. Still, you long to hear it one more time, the tune only half unfolded, half light, half gone. A girl who wants to be air, a boy who is song. What is this life then but a means to get to the other side, where voice and body, being one, no longer fight? I once saw in Stratford-on-Avon, walking up the hill to the Globe Theatre to see a wonderful production of Twelfth Night, I once saw a young man singing Peter Gabriel's beautiful song Salisbury Hill on the hill outside the theater, and was absolutely convinced for a moment that I was seeing Orpheus. It was a magic moment I've never forgotten. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with a cheerful poem. I promised I would. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please, if you would, if you're enjoying these little videos, like them, share them. They get archived on Facebook here. They get archived on AlanSquirePublishing.com. You can watch them on YouTube. Just Google Alan Squire. Look for Alan Squire Publishing on YouTube and you'll find us. They'll all be there. Remember that Amazon is not delivering books right now, but ASP is. So our friends at Santa Fe Writers Project. And we've got bundles of sales on both our sites. If you can buy books now, it'd be a great time to do it. A lot of small presses are suffering, and we'll be forever grateful. And you'll get some pretty great literature. This poem is called To the Wine Taster, and I've got my prop here for show and tell. It is based on a poem. It is based on a photo that I saw that a friend of mine took at a wine tasting. In that photo, there's a couple sitting, drinking wine, and they are just the most miserable looking people you can possibly imagine. He's staring suspiciously into his glass as though something in it might bite him. She's looking with disdain at her spitting cup, and the entire photo was just so depressing and so not what Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, would have wanted, that I wrote this. This is in my last book, The Last Girl. With the cover, I should add that the cover of that book is by the amazingly talented Lisa Montag Brotman. Is that not a gorgeous painting? Designed, as all our books are designed, by our cover designer, Randy Stannard, another genius. Thank you for listening. Thanks for joining us. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but these little videos are certainly helping me get through this. And I really hope they're doing you some good as well. Please send me suggestions, advice, things you'd like me to cover, things you think I could do better, because I'm learning as I go. And thanks for listening. This is called To the Wine Taster. Dionysus would slap you silly if he could see you now, sniffing and twirling and sipping and, dear God, spitting it out. What mortal arrogance, the mess you've made of his gift. Now, let's start over. Throw back your head and drain this puny glass with one loud gulp. Then roar, for a cup carved out of animal horn, deep enough that when you reach the bottom, you'll see 2 horns, 2 hands, 2 mouths. Then you'll be worthy to grab the woman on your left, who feels as you do now the rush of sweet blood to the brain and to the thighs, and put your grape-stained mouth to hers. We are, all of us, nothing more than empty vessels that the god can fill with his heart-made, heart-poured wine. Drink, you fool, and love. Become divine. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us at Allen Squire Publishing, a small press with big ideas. I'm Rose Solari, and I'll be back here next Wednesday at 4 p.m. EST for my final program for National Poetry Month. And then in May, I'll start up a new strand, and I'm ready to include prose, poetry, creative nonfiction, drama, music, visual art. Tell me what you want to talk about, and I'll work on it. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll get through this quarantine time. I'll see you on the other side. Thanks for listening.